The third step of that analysis of thought would be the understanding, and that is the hardest step.
Yes.
That's the hardest.
I'm joined this evening by Sister Mary Francis. Sister Mary Francis is the head of curriculum development at Queen of All Saints Academy. She's also the principal of the school at this time. And Sister Mary Francis, a lot of the parents have been asking, since our last info session, have been asking questions about the curriculum that is used at Queen of All Saints Academy. A lot of them could be summarized with the basic question, why is our program classical? Why do we say it is classical?
Well, yes. So, sister, I think I would begin by informing our listeners that this is a vast subject, and what we will attempt to do here is just summarize the essential element of the classical education. And I would also distinguish, I would say that the classical education of the 16th century is different from the classical education of the 21st century.
Right.
For obvious reasons, they're not going to be the same, exactly the same. But that being said, they do share the same formal object, we would say, the same essential primary focus, and that is the training of the faculties, primarily the intellect and the training of the will. And yes, so that is their essential goal, and that is what the classical educators of the 1500s were doing. That's what classical educators of today are doing.
Right. So when we say we're classical, you're just differentiating and saying, before we go into details of the curriculum, what makes something classical is that essential piece. Your focus is training the mind.
Yes, the training of the faculties, and you can understand it a little better if we think about that word education, which comes from the Latin educere, which means to draw out. So we're not putting in subject matter or content or data. We are drawing out and developing the faculty so that it can function with a facility. And that takes many years. It takes many years and patient training, and that's the task of a classical education. And it's distinct from a modern system of education, which has the object to put in, right? And so you hear about all these numerous credits or
right, how far you can get in science by the time, or how far you can get in math by the time you graduate. That's all. Can I finish calculus by junior year? So many courses.
Yes, and you can lose, it's very easy to lose the focus on that essential element, which is so important. It surpasses everything else. It's the most important thing we are doing, and so we have to be laser focused on that. And then everything else, the content, it must be there. It's kind of like the weights in the gym. You have to have some tool, right, in order to exercise yourself, but it's secondary. The goal is the facility of the faculty, the habit of the faculty. And
right, so just as when you're exercising the body, the way that the weights obviously are simply the tools.
Yes.
So you're saying that the content you're using, it's just like the weights, and at the end of the day, you're aiming for that mental fitness, and that's got to remain the primary focus.
Yes, that's the foundation, and then everything else is built on it. So you have there's a study, Dr. Carl Hildebrand in the 1880s. He wrote in the Contemporary Review. He said that he was a historian and a scholar, and he said that a prominent banker in a foreign capital, he said he had brought in 30 scholars, right, on a trial basis to his offices, and these scholars had been educated for commerce, so fit for commerce, essentially, or supposedly. And he said that not a single one passed his trial. And on the other hand, the students who came from the grammar schools, who had no exposure to business, were able to master it in a very short time and to be successful in his firm. And I'm sure that there are many studies done.
So even in the 1880s, you already had these these modern practical schools that kind of lost that focus of training the mind, were more knowledge-based, putting in data. It's reminding me, remembering bits and pieces from my training. Don't tell my chemistry students, I have forgotten a lot of things. But there was one that really struck me. There was a study done, 10 years of study and discussion by the University of Berlin. And they addressed a memorandum to the Ministry of Instruction and declaring that students from the modern practical schools were not fitted for university courses on par with students from the classical schools. And I don't remember all the details, but some of the reasons they listed, they brought up slower development, inferiority of private research. That was a problem they were having, and finally lack of independent judgment. And this was one, there was one among what I remember to have been a wealth of data and testimony, but
Yes.
and that was simply a study that was brought up for the classical method in that book. That was Jesuit Education by Schwickerath.
Oh, yes, there's many instances and evidences brought up in that book.
Mhm.
It's a great read for anyone interested in
Yes.
classical education, but and that's what we share. That's what all classical educators share today. They're trying to do that. They're trying to lay that foundation, that all important, those all important habits of thinking correctly and acting rightly. And after that, the child is fit for anything, any profession, any walk of life that he or she may be called to is easy, or he can make a success of that.
Right. Now, I could see though how someone would say, but if you're going through all these courses, you have all this data and knowledge that you're accumulating, the mind will be trained simply by the fact that you're having to memorize all the material, master all those processes. So when you say though, training the mind, training the faculties, could you give an example of how that might be different in a classical school? How an exercise might be different in a classical school versus the same subject or study done in a public school classroom that isn't following the classical method?
Really, you're when we say training the mind, we want the mind to have habits of logical thinking so that it can discern truth from falsehood easily and accurately and even swiftly. And it can make sound judgments. And really, the mind is like a sharpened sword, ready to be drawn and used in any circumstance, for any reason, in any practical problem. And I think a good example might be the literature class and or our English composition class. And you might see in a public school or modern school, you might see a book list of 100 texts that we want the child to get through.
Right. With maybe write a book report on
Correct.
it, but there
Right.
isn't really
a little
any
summary.
other-
Yes.
Right.
Right. Whereas in a classical classroom, you will see the teacher select a passage or a paragraph from one of those books, and of course, it would be a very well-chosen paragraph. It wouldn't just be ordinary content, but you would see a teacher choose maybe one paragraph and spend a whole class and even a week analyzing that content. And so it's a very different, it's not so much the content or the quantity of content, we're talking about quality and the exercise of the faculty.
So how would that look though? Because some of the words that you're using, the sound judgment, those faculties, the logic, the reasoning, the judgment, how would you draw that out from a child who's not mature, maybe distracted, uninterested?
Yes, so well, the answer is it's work, it's labor, and that's the job of the educator, right? They're in the classroom, they are performing this work over and over again. And an example would be if you take a stanza from Thomas Gray's poem, The Elegy, written in a country churchyard. Let's say we take that first stanza. The teacher, right, would first lead the students, and again, there's much guidance, because again, you're training the faculty.
And probably the guidance will vary as well, depending on their level.
Oh, for
Their
sure,
age,
yes.
what grade they're
Yes.
at, what their prerequisite learning is.
Yes, exactly. And also the depth of analysis, right?
Mhm.
Then and the difficulty of the text. So the teacher would first guide the students through an analysis of the thought. Then there would be an analysis of the form.
Okay, well, I
and-
don't, what do you mean by analysis of the thought? Do you mean simply speaking about the meaning that the author intended?
Yes, yes. So basically you would first look at the ideas, and we would say, for the students, we would say, okay, we're going to study what the words and phrases mean. So we're going
the
to understand the
vocabulary,
idea.
you know, what,
Yes.
so if I remember, I actually don't know that poem very well, but he mentions the curfew, and so you would start by just basic vocab study.
Yes, and a very important point is that the student has to re-express those ideas in his own words in order to have sufficiently mastered them, right? So you're constantly asking them, like what, or can you think of an example? And so that they really become a master of that idea. And so you first look at the ideas, and then you move on to a study of the judgments, right? And the judgment, that's obviously a philosophical term, but for the students, we say the sentences. What do the sentences mean? What are the predications here? What's being said about the thing in each of these sentences in your own words? And then lastly, the third step of that analysis of thought would be the understanding of the reasoning, the whole reasoning. So essentially you are trying to express the syllogism in the stanza. What's the conclusion being inferred here in the first stanza?
Right.
And that is the hardest step.
Yeah.
That's the hardest.
Yes, even as I'm trying to imagine, I'm thinking of that poem and trying to imagine, you know, what that conclusion would be. My mind's getting tired, trying to think of
Right.
what would be.
Exactly. Oh
what
no,
would the
it's
conclusion
a
be?
fatiguing.
So yes, the labor of the mind can be tiring. So yes, that can be challenging. Keep them engaged, keep them motivated.
Right.
That's why the educator is so important. In the
Correct,
classroom.
exactly. And then that's just the first step. And then afterward, you would analyze the form, and that's how the ideas are closed, right? The style. And that would depend on your level of English composition, or whether it's the grammar, or you're studying the accurate word, the precise word,
or even the accidentals, like the figures of speech.
Yes, exactly. And then so that's the analysis of the form. Some people call it the rhetorical analysis. And then finally, if it's what this content was suitable for that, you would then analyze the moral. And that's very important, because now we're touching on the will, and we are trying to ennoble and bring the will to aspire for the good. And especially after this depth of understanding of the passage and the beautiful language surrounding it, the child is so filled with admiration of the virtue that they can't help but love it and want to go after it. Literature gives us a very good example of how we can touch or train all the faculties in one setting. But all the subjects are I would say, treated in that way. So when you study history, we're not just trying to amass, many knowledge about history. Of course, that is a focus, but it's not primary. It is secondary. So for example, if you're studying the Crusades, it's on my mind because we're doing that in 8th grade right now.
Okay.
So if you're studying the Crusades, the children, yes, will know the facts, the year, the dates, the personages, the circumstances, but they will much more importantly have to arrive with guidance at an understanding of the morality, right, and the validity of the Crusades. What was motivating the Crusaders, and were they right, and etc. And that's essential. We're not just here to train the memory or to fill them with this knowledge. We're trying to exercise them using that knowledge.
Now, earlier you had said content was secondary. So even though important, content is secondary, but I can see why, though secondary, it is so important, because if you are trying to train the intellect to know the truth, right, and train the will to love virtue, love goodness, you couldn't do that if you were using content which was unedifying, immoral. You know, I can see why the secondary, the content, the choice of content is very important to, in order to exercise all those faculties.
Correct, yes. So of course, the content must all be free of error and morally acceptable. And beyond that, we like it to have literary value. We like it to have lofty, i.e. lofty examples of virtue, and yes, so it's chosen with great care.
And what is the source of the content that we use?
Yes, so in the lower grades, I would say primarily we are looking to the Christian Brothers and the Brothers of the Christian Schools.
And by that, you are referring to the order founded by St. John Baptist de la Salle?
Yes, actually a congregation which he founded, the Institute of the Brothers of the Christian Schools, in 1680. And his focus was education of the primary years. So of course he's an authority, and he has vast experience, and then also a Catholic. He's a saint. So we look to him for the lower grades, and not only is he Catholic, but his principles of pedagogy align perfectly with those of the classical system. He has that same object, the training of the faculties, and not so much a putting in, but development of those faculties. So we use his works very much in the lower grades, along with some other sources. And then in the higher grades, we use the Ratio Studiorum of the Jesuits.
Okay, yes, and that I know was a big part of the teacher training in preparing them, especially for teaching the high school courses where they are working on the trivium so heavily, the philosophy and the
Yes, exactly. So the Ratio was constituted by the Jesuits in 1599, and essentially you had the best experts in the world, the Jesuits, right, who were just looked to as the educators of their time. And they came together and they formulated this ratio, or plan of studies, and it has stood the test of 300 years, right, in its wisdom and its deep principles, and essentially, and again, the same principle, is at the heart of it, and that is the training of the faculty. It's simple and it's unified, and everything is tending towards that goal. So we use that for the higher grades.
Now, if the Jesuit Ratio was developed earlier than the Christian Brothers, do they align?
Yes, exactly. And it's simply that the Christian Brothers were working with the children, right, in the earlier years.
You could say they were preparing them for
correct,
the Jesuit
exactly.
schools.
Yes. Those students who were prepared would then move on in the completion, right, of their education, and they would move on to the secondary schools of perhaps the Jesuits if they could get in, if they were very good. But yes, they were preparing for that stage.
Right. Now, you said earlier, when we choose a source, we want it obviously to have literary value, to have, high ideas, but also to be morally acceptable and free of error.
Yes.
So I can understand if you're obviously sourcing from the Christian Brothers and the Jesuits, two religious orders. But as far as classical content, if you read a classical, even just Google classical book list, many of those are not exactly inspiring morally or free of error. I mean, if you
correct,
classical book list has
and for that reason, almost all the contemporary works that we are using in the school are edited for that reason. So the Jesuits would expurgate, or they'd have their expurgated editions of the Greek or Latin classics, and so we must do the same. Yes,
that's interesting. I did not know that. So even at that time, even in the late 1500s, even then, even in the colleges for adults, you're saying they would expurgate and edit the content they were using, the classics, so the Roman or Greek classics.
Yes, correct. And yes, so they would remove anything that was objectionable, or in some cases, of course, for in the classical literature, there's some obscene even content that it would not be fit for the youth to consume, or for anyone who didn't have the training to consume, and read freely.
Right. Now that seems, I mean, it sounds great, to only have, beautiful elevating content, but I could see how someone would say, to be well educated, wouldn't it be good to have a certain knowledge of what is popular, what is well known, or is considered to be well known, even from a point of view of being able to identify that it's wrong or refute it even. So for example, I know a classic reading list will even have things like Kant and Origin of Species by Darwin, So for someone to be well educated,
Yes.
I could see how you could think, it's important to have a certain knowledge of those things.
Correct. Oh, yes, and that does have its place in, for instance, in the high school, where the students are studying philosophy, for instance, or psychology. The teacher will bring in extracts, right, from those works, and the students will read them and be brought to perceive the error, right, and learn to respond to that. What's the correct response to those
Okay,
things?
so it would be a short extract, so let's say a few paragraphs read in class with the teacher.
Correct.
The philosophy
Yes,
teacher,
very
who would be
important.
pointing
Yes,
out
exactly.
the meaning and the error.
Correct. That's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to train the mind to discern the truth, and to make judgments about whether something is true or false. So gradually you might introduce those things as a part of that training, but it would be with great care, and it would
Right, so you wouldn't hand a teenager Origin of Species by Darwin and the Quran and say, these are classic books, go home and read them, and hopefully you can figure out what's wrong and what's right and come out unscathed of error and.
Right,
immorality.
exactly,
Right.
exactly. That's our work, is to train them to be able to do that.
So basically to train the intellect and the will, very important faculties, you have
Correct.
to be immersing them in truth and goodness.
Yes, and that was the mind of the church. That's why the Index of Prohibited Books was established in 1559, because of that danger to faith and morals.
Right, and that was in place until after the Second Vatican Council, 1960s, it was.
Yes, I
generally
think
withdrawn.
1966 it was
Mhm.
abolished, but yes, there are works out there that are dangerous to Catholic faith and morals. So of course, to lead them to erroneous works would go counter to what we're trying to do. We're trying to train the faculties of the intellect to the truth, and the will to the good.
Right, exactly. Now, something else too is that you wouldn't know this unless you looked at our full reading list, but I don't think there is not a single romantic novel in our choice of novels. There's not a single romantic novel on the reading list, and why is that?
Yes, so again, there's no reason, right, to feed the appetite, right, for romance, which is already there in excess through original sin. In a Catholic education, you're not going to feed the fire, as they would say.
Stoke the flames.
Correct.
And I can see how especially if you had a heavy dosage of that, you were reading romantic novels on a daily basis, you could, especially in the teenagers, it reminds me actually of the story in the biography of Saint Teresa of Avila. She actually comments on her loss of devotion in her teenage years. So she had, great devotion. I'm sure everyone knows the story of her wanting to go to her martyrdom with her brother, run away to be martyred. And in her teenage years, she lost very much that devotion, became very worldly, very vain, so much so that, if I remember correctly, her father was worried for her spiritual life and decided he needed to do something about it, send her away. He sent her to a nun's boarding school.
Yes, correct.
And she attributes that in her biography to the fact that her cousin was sneaking her the latest trend that was by no means popular or, approved of, but the novels of chivalry, which I'm sure it was not explicit or immoral, but basically romantic damsels in distress. And she comments on what a bad effect that had on her spiritual life at that time.
Correct. And then vice versa, right? We remember later in her life, she had to read to her uncle, right, for many hours, these dry spiritual
Yes,
treatises.
he was an invalid.
Correct.
And she visited
Right.
him.
And she, of course, was not at all attracted to reading these things. And it was difficult for her. She did it out of love for him. But in the end, she grew to love and to want to aspire after the virtues and the truth that she was reading in those pages. And so again, that's what we're trying to do here. A novel is going to be far more attractive, right? Because it's feeding the lower appetites. And so there's that immediate attraction for those things. But little by little, we want the children to love higher things.
Right. So basically in moderation, and obviously if it's a good novel.
Correct. Yes.
If it's a good novel in
Yes,
moderation though,
correct.
because it's not the highest form of literature.
Yes,
and
but recreational
Mhm.
reading of a clean novel, yes, you could do that. And so we have a few novels. You'll see Lassie Come Home
Yes, in
and some
fact,
of the
I think that's
classics.
Captain's Courageous.
Yes,
Right
right,
behind
exactly.
you.
And again, we still want there to be some value in those
Right, literary
pages.
value.
Yes,
Mhm.
correct.
Outside of literature, is there anything that comes to mind that you would say you encountered commonly, at least, in modern classical curriculum? So what you would get from a well-known publisher that basically was insufficient and motivated us to build our own exercises, to really construct our own curriculum? Is there anything that comes to
Yes,
mind?
well, I guess aside from the previous topic, which is everything has to be free of error and morally uplifting, you're going to see the lack of that focus of exercise or of training, right? And developing the habits of logical thinking. So a good example is the composition class, where you'll see a lot of theory, maybe a lot of style and all these principles, but there's not nearly enough practice or exercise or challenge of the faculty of the
Oh, okay,
Mhm.
so basically they're covering a lot of theory, the narrative, the dialogue, the figures of speech.
Correct.
But
The slanted, all of that.
yes, it's all there, but
Mhm.
then there's insufficient exercise to form the habit of
Yes,
good
exactly.
thinking, good composition.
Yes,
Now,
exactly.
what about, because I think a concern a lot of parents have, I've heard it from both sides, but the rigor of the program, is it too rigorous? Is it extreme? I've actually heard it also from the other side. Some parents are concerned because their child is gifted. In general, would you say it might be too rigorous or possibly too easy if the child's gifted?
So yes, of course, in a large classroom, you're going to have some students who might be, below the bar or the standard set for that class. They might be above the bar, but essentially what we do is we try to achieve a balance between those two extremes, and we use, of course, we do consult other curricula for what we are requiring, as well as of course the Jesuits and the Christian Brothers. But if a child is I would say significantly advanced for his or her grade level, then the answer would be no, we would not hold them back. That would be, counter to what we're trying to do here. We want them to reach the highest point of the perfection of their faculties. So we will push them forward. We would have them, we would assess them and move them on to the next grade level, and then vice versa. If a student is very much struggling, and that happens frequently in the school because children join us, families will join us every step of our program all the way through.
Right.
We'll have new admissions.
We're seeing a lot of that right now, actually, because we're about to start the third week of class. And it's right about that point that the teachers know the students well enough to decide if their placement needs adjusted or if they simply need a little extra support, some tutoring. So we were just having a discussion today about one of the high school students that needs moved up especially in the composition course.
Yes,
And,
yes.
and vice versa. Some of the younger students, we have an 8th grader who will probably need to go back and study some prerequisites in almost all the subjects before they can really participate fully in the 8th grade classes. So, but it is true, I agree that the children adapt and catch up very quickly. It is amazing how once they begin the exercise and the practice and they grasp those basics, they move very quickly. And can you do that though? What about is that also true of the upper grades? Are you able to do that in high school, or are you kind of stuck as far as getting?
No, actually, high school is can be very customized. You can opt out of certain credits, or classes, you can, I would say, jump around, right, in different levels of, say, that maybe you're very good at math, but you haven't really had a good grounding in language. So you might go to the first English level, but a higher math. And that's very possible in the high school levels because we have many teachers, right?
Right, and we also offer even the very advanced courses.
Correct,
the AP,
yes.
So I know, for example, my AP chemistry class, it's always a small class. There are very few students in 11th grade. It's meant for the 11th grade students who would be so far ahead, so advanced in the mathematics and sciences that they would want to take on that extra challenge while maintaining the rigorous standards in the language arts, because you can't drop one to favor the other. That would go against, the classical method. But yeah, so if that's something that they're ready for and will actually be a good next step for them, that's available. But it's certainly not for everyone. Someone else might be more talented in languages. They might excel in language and want to go further in composition, so the AP literature,
yes,
or take on a
Latin,
third, fourth year.
Yeah, they might take 4 years of Latin and study the authors. Yes.
Now, what if the child? Another question that I think is common. This is, I think, more so in middle school, those early teenage years. What if the child is not motivated or simply immature, and I think parents worry that they don't have the maturity or maybe just the motivation to succeed, especially in the flex program, because it is more of a homeschool style program where there's more responsibility put on them to complete their assignments, complete the instructional videos on that daily basis. So what would you say if the worry is they may be too immature or simply lacking the motivation to succeed?
Yes, so I would say if those habits, right, of study or that inclination to learning is not yet there, fully formed, I would counsel the parents to start small, start with a smaller workload and maybe only enroll in part-time part of the classes, and again, gradually the habit will be formed and the child can take on more, yes, as time goes by.
And parents will often ask, what is the utility of a given subject in a curricula? And I think this would be true of any school. What is the utility of a given subject? And it varies. I think some parents very often ask, what is the utility of Latin? Latin is a dead language. Or I once had a parent who came from a family of, I think, artists and musicians, and they said, I don't see the point of my child learning algebra. They're not going to be an engineer.
Right.
They'll never make use of the algebra. So what would you say? I know we can't address, all the subjects a parent will ask about, but in general, what would you say if a parent was asking about the purpose of a subject for which they can't see the practical application?
Yeah, so again, practical application later in life is not really our purpose. We're laying that foundation which equips the child to really enter any or specialize in any area. So we're laying that foundation. So, but that being said, there are, parents, they can opt out of certain subjects. I would say though that having an accredited diploma is usually
right.
desirable and a good security for, for the future, and a matter of practical prudence in a lot of cases. So that is to be considered. And but I would also say that no matter what subject we're teaching, we're all working towards that common goal of the training of the mind and of the will. So that's the purpose. We might
Right.
not see a practical, of course, they're not going to go walk to the grocery store and speak in Latin, right? There's something much deeper going on, and something that we might not appreciate at that time, right? But later we see the fruits.
Yes, yes, and I would say too, if you've been trained, if a teacher has been classically trained in the classical method, it will change very much the way they present matter, the way their objectives in a course will be vastly different
Yes.
from a teacher who is simply trying to achieve that knowledge standard. For example, in the AP chemistry, the point is not to pass the AP exam. Obviously, if you've done a good job, they will be capable of passing that exam, but it is not at all the point of the course. And, in the course, even lesson 2, matter and energy, you're already discussing asking them to analyze their thought in the scientific process and come to logical conclusions and identify errors in setting up their experiment that would lead to that,
Correct.
that faulty conclusion. And you really do present the matter in a very different
Correct,
way.
right. And again, I would remind that the education the purpose is not to specialize, right? That comes later, whether you're going to be a chemist or a biologist or computer engineer, or a mother, right? That will come later. And what we're doing is equipping and training the mind. They have to first learn to use the mind, right? And then they can, and all doors open to them, essentially, right? Whatever interest or field they want to specialize in. We're not a trade school. We're not a trade school. We are educating, and we want them to be able to use data and information correctly, rather than just give them the data. They have to be able to use it correctly. They have to be able to use that tool, and that's our goal here.
Now, I think another question that's common, especially for Catholic parents, traditional Catholic parents who understand that the parent is the primary educator, the education takes place in the home, they have that responsibility of forming the child. What would be the reason, or is there any advantage to having another educator, a religious educator? What would you say would be the advantage of that?
School has always been an extension of the home, right? We are here to help, and the parent is the primary educator. So that being said, parents often they do turn to us for help because they don't have the time or the expertise to train the child in all the fields, and they delegate this task to teachers who have the time, because that is their occupation. And this is especially true of religious teachers who have consecrated their lives to God and to God in this duty in a special way. So therefore, the school gives the parents the opportunity to take advantage of this body of teachers who have the time to train themselves in that way.
Right. So for example, that, the parent might have a certain expertise. They might be an expert historian, but they might not have the philosophy that would equip a teacher for addressing a classical history lesson, drawing those conclusions and that moral lesson.
Correct.
At least especially in the trivium and the highest levels in the high school.
Yes, correct.
So, and I can see that, because I don't think, even in our own school, we have, 30 plus teachers.
Yes.
But still, no teacher is going to take on.
No, not by any means,
No,
right?
so I only teach the AP chemistry right now, and I might be able to take on one more course, which I've
Yes.
done. I have taught the Latin for a certain year, but the amount of preparation
Mhm.
and expertise needed to really guide them in that classical method in those, especially in the higher grades, it's
Correct, and it's ongoing. It's not, okay, we're ready, I'm ready to teach the rest of my life. No, you every summer, right, we're training the teachers and we are perfecting the curriculum and because it is a tremendous work. It is a great work and yes, no teacher is going to be expert in all areas. We have our teachers who are very good in training up the younger children in the primary years, and then there's teachers who are very good with the middle school, and then the teachers in high school who specialize in the sciences or the maths or the history or philosophy, right? We have the clergy who teach the catechism. So it's a wealth, right, of time and training that we are offering or putting at the service of parents and so many and parents want to take advantage of that help that we are holding out to them.
Right now, we've spoken a lot about the curriculum, how it was developed, where it came from, gave an example of what an exercise might consist of. But we haven't really spoken about any of the extracurriculars, and I don't want to go too much longer. I want to try to keep this as short as possible, but just briefly, what would you say what is the purpose of an extracurricular activity? For example, if a parent's enrolling in the Ultimate Flex, they have all of the clubs they can choose from. They can come to the chant class, which is every morning. The little ones have their choir session, or the chess club meets once a week, And there are other extracurriculars too, in-person events, but just in general, what would you say, how does extracurricular fit into the education plan?
So I guess there's a lot to cover there, but of course for many students, there's the peer influence is very powerful. The social aspect of having a peer who is going through the same educational journey and to whom you can turn and talk about your scores on the test or upcoming competitions or etc. That's a very it's a strong motivator for many children, and so we try to provide that in the extracurriculars as well as wholesome recreation and according to the child's interests. But then there's the development of the whole child that we're also looking to, right? And so we in this talk have been principally speaking about the intellectual education, right? The intellectual scope or the intellectual aspect of the classical education. But classical education, it encompasses the whole child, his nature in all its aspects. And so the goal of the education is simple, but it's complex in its parts. And so you have the intellectual and the moral formation, which we've been discussing, the religious formation, the physical and the social aspect as well to be perfected. And so parents will want to take advantage of all the aspects of the complete education. So some will be physically on campus with us for that reason. So they have the whole package, if you want, right? The complete education. But obviously, many cannot take advantage of that. So we try to supply that in our clubs, our music program, our in-person events, and the the students are invited that in the chant club, they're invited to join us for the end of year concert. And that is an important factor. It's a motivator, but it also is giving us a well-rounded formation of the whole nature of the child.
I have seen extracurriculars in general, they boost morale.
Yes. Correct.
Education is hard work, and as the students encounter that on a day-to-day basis, they're get tired after school. They might wake up tired in the morning, having that competition that they're preparing
Yes,
for, or
right.
being able to talk to a friend about how they did on a test,
Mhm.
you can see it. I mean, obviously you said it contributes to the education of the whole child, but I have seen very much so the motivational boost
Correct.
that
Yes, exactly.
those can have.
Right, and the Germans called the school, their college is the gymnasium, right? It was hard work, but we are all committed to meeting at the gym, and we're all going to do this hard work together. And I think there is something to be said there. It's a culture, it's a certain culture, and it's a culture of excellence. And the children, they want it. They develop a love for it and an appetite for it. And so yes, all of these things we put in place in order to achieve that goal, that the training of the faculties, which is paramount.
To wrap up, this is a question that's come up, just kind of a fun ending, from parents who are currently enrolled. So parents who have students in the school in the live program where they're attending live on a daily basis with the campus students. And I think also just from some of our followers who receive our newsletter, asking whether we would ever consider opening up St. Thomas Aquinas College, which is the sisters college, the training program that the sisters complete upon entering. So they have about 5.5 years of training in St. Thomas Aquinas College to become an educator, and asking if we would ever consider opening that up to secular. So if a young lady wanted to pursue a teaching career, would she be able to pursue her, her degree or her certification at St. Thomas Aquinas College? And I think also even from parents just saying, could I ever do a course to continue my own education?
And much as we would love to open something like that up to our parents, I think I would have to be honest and say it would be far in the future. I think right now our goal is we're working to package this this curriculum for homeschool parents so that they can take advantage of it. But yes, of course, that would be a
So
wonderful
eventually
goal.
we could get it packaged as well, kind of like the homeschool program, perhaps someday.
Yes, yes, perhaps someday. Right.
All right, well, thank you, sister. I think we'll end there. I know we didn't answer every question individually, but we definitely, I think, addressed in a general manner questions about our curriculum, where it comes from. And I think we also ended up discussing classical education, which is fun always to discuss, but thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, sister.